Hey guys, it's Neffy. I have a question that I've been receiving a lot and I've been seeing floating around social media. And so I want to go ahead and take some time to address that question. And that question is, was Jesus a Christian? And the thought behind it is, if Jesus wasn't a Christian, then why are you a Christian instead of whatever Jesus was? So let's go ahead and define terms. Let's break the question down. What does Christian mean? The original word Christianos means followers of Christ. Very straightforward. Christian means follower of Christ. Where does the word Christian appear in the Bible to give us a little bit more understanding perhaps as to what the word may mean and how it's used? The word Christian appears 3 times in the Bible. We'll first go to Acts 11:26. It says, and the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. They were called Christians, implying that the term was given to them. Scholars say that Christian, the word Christian originally, or the title Christian originally, was a derogatory term intended to be an offensive term. So then our next appearance we'll go to is Acts 26:28, just a few chapters away, Acts 26:28. And then it says, then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. Basically, he said, I wish you would become a Christian. So the first century Christians clearly accepted the term and wished others to be Christians as well. As a side note, I have had experiences where some Hebrew Israelites would say that we shouldn't follow Christianity because Christianity isn't in the Bible. But the word Christian clearly is, and then the letters ITY would just be a suffix. So the next occurrence of Christian in the Bible is 1 Peter 4:16, our third occurrence. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. Christians were persecuted for their beliefs, for following Christ, for believing that Jesus was who he said he was, and following his teachings. So if you were a Christian, it wasn't just a matter of believing who Christ was, but also your actions would be based on your beliefs, right? And so those actions would often call for scorn and ridicule from others. So what was Jesus's religion, right? We want to know if Jesus was a Christian, and if he wasn't, what was he? And whatever that is, why you ain't doing that? All right, so Jesus was a Jew. Plain and simple. I think pretty much everybody knows that, especially people who ask the question, was Jesus a Christian? They know he was a Jew. And that's pretty much where the question comes from. Nevertheless, we're still going to break this down. We still got some more to go. Yes, we do. What's the connection then between, if any, between Christianity and Judaism? So I get this question a lot, and the way I see it, Judaism was always intended to become Christianity. Christianity is Judaism fulfilled. They are 2 phases of the same religion. But before we dive more into that, let's just bust down really quick what a Jew is. A Jew, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, is a Hebrew or Yehudai. Once again, I don't speak Hebrew, so excuse me for the pronunciation if it's off. Nevertheless, a person whose religion is Judaism. In the broader sense of the term, a Jew is any person belonging to the worldwide group that constitutes, through descent or conversion, a continuation of the ancient Jewish people who were themselves descendants of the Hebrews of the Bible. In parentheses, we have their Old Testament. More on that later. In ancient times, a Yehudai was originally a member of Judah, i.e. either the tribe of Judah, one of the 12 tribes that took possession of the promised land, or of the subsequent kingdom of Judah, in contrast to the rival kingdom of Israel to the north. The Jewish people as a whole, initially called Hebrews, were known as Israelites from the time of their entrance to the Holy Land to the end of Babylonian exile in 538 BC. It says BCE. We stick with the BC. Power to the church. You feel me? Thereafter, the term Yehudai was used to signify all adherents of Judaism. You can read more on the Encyclopedia Britannica website. But it says here basically, because there is a debate or a discussion about whether the term Jew is appropriate, because as we just mentioned, we had the kingdoms that was divided into two. So some people say, well, it only signifies the tribe of Judah. We shouldn't be calling ourselves Jews. They should call themselves Hebrews. The religion was really the Hebrew religion. Whatever. It says clearly here that the term Yehudai, or Jew, was used to signify all adherents of Judaism. So let's put it this way. And thinking about our question as to whether Jesus was a Christian, most Christians understand that Hebrews, or the Jews, follow the Old Testament. Christians in theory follow both the Old and New Testaments. And I say in theory because some of us be on some wild stuff and be trying to throw the whole Old Testament in the garbage because we under the New Covenant and all that there. Okay, but supposedly and in theory, Christians have a Bible which is comprised of both the Old and New Testaments. So here is a comparison of the Christian Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. Okay, you can pause here if you'd like, take a moment to look at the chart. And Google it on your own. You'll see that they're structured and organized a little differently, but they are the exact same. They are the same. So originally there was only the Old Testament. When Jesus was walking around, people say, well, Jesus ain't had no Bible. Why nobody in the Bible ain't had no Bible? People in the Bible did have a Bible. They had the Old Testament. They had the Hebrew Bible as we call it today. And so when Jesus came, he was born, died, resurrected, and ascended. We then added the New Testament to record those events and the history of the early church, and it also includes an expansion of Old Testament prophecies. Now, what do I mean by that? For example, Revelation. We look at Revelations for most of us, and we see all types of symbolism and new scary things most of us believe haven't happened yet, and so we think that this is something new. But all of the prophecies in Revelation and throughout the Bible are rooted in the Old Testament. So as I said, we already had the Old Testament when Jesus was walking around. Then we had to record the new stuff that went down. So we added the New Testament. Now, Old Testament and New Testament. Do Christians believe that there are two Bibles? No. Christians don't say we have two Bibles. There is one Bible divided into two parts. One Bible, two sections. Old Testament plus New Testament equals the Bible. You don't hear Christians say the Bibles. You don't hear them say that. We say the Bible. It's one book. So if someone says, for example, just let's say you met somebody and they say, well, I don't believe in the New Testament. The whole New Testament is trash. I only believe in the Old Testament. Can that person be a Christian? Just logically, can that person be a Christian? No, because if you throw the New Testament away, you're throwing away everything that tells us about who Christ is and what he did and how he fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures. So the New Testament is what tells us about Jesus. So you can't just throw out the New Testament and still call yourself a Christian. Similarly, the Judaic faith, Judaism as it is commonly called, and Christianity are the same faith. One faith, two parts. Now, I ain't just going to say that and not break it down for you. Y'all should know me better than that by now, right? So let me give you a little bit of a detail and explanation as to what I mean by that. Now, the first prophecy regarding Jesus was in Genesis. In what? Genesis, that's what? That's Old Testament. That's actually the first prophecy in the Bible, period. So it's the first prophecy. The first prophecy is about Jesus, and it's in the Old Testament. Genesis 3:15, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Christians understand that to be referring to Jesus. That's what the prophecy is about. And so we have also prophecies in Isaiah that talk about the virgin conceiving, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace coming. These are things that are talking about Jesus in the Old Testament. And then Jesus comes to fulfill those things. So there are many, many prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament. They were filled in the New Testament. And here are a few you can take a look at. You can pause once again and scroll through these and take notes and match them. But basically, Jesus came to do the things that the Bible, Old Testament, said he would do. He did them. Okay, so once again, these are just a few examples that you can go ahead and take a look at. And the more you study the Bible, the more clearly you'll find Jesus on every page. The entire Bible is about Jesus. And so, as an example, right? There's a famous passage about Jesus coming to be baptized by John the Baptist. And it says, John 1:29, the next day John seeth Jesus coming unto him, and said, behold, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sins of the world. Why? That's a weird thing to say. Like, why would you call somebody a lamb that takes away sin? How do lambs take away sin? What is he referring to? He's referring to the Old Testament practice of the sacrificial system, which we find primarily in Leviticus. For example, here's one example, Leviticus 9 verse 3. And unto the children of Israel thou shalt speak, saying, take ye a kid of goats for sin offering, and a calf and a lamb, both of the first year, without blemish, for a burnt offering. So the sacrificial system used animals to take away sins. They were offerings that were made to God to take away sins. Other examples of lambs in the Old Testament, we have Genesis 4 verse 7. And Isaac spake up unto Abraham his father, and said, my father. And he said, here am I, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Here we have a father sacrificing his son as an offering, okay? This also illustrates the fact that lambs are being offered prior to what we understand to be given to us in Exodus and the whole Mosaic system. But that's a discussion for another time. Okay, so our next example here, just briefly, Exodus 12 verse 3, it says, speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, in the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house. What is this referring to? This is Passover. So when the Jews were in Egypt, right before they left, they had the Passover and they sacrificed a lamb. What did they use the blood of the lamb for? To put it on the doorpost so that when the angel of destruction came through, it would pass over them. That's why they called it Passover. And it was for protection. It was a symbol of allegiance to God, and that symbol offered protection. The blood protects us, just like the blood of Christ protects us from the effects of our sin, so long as we remain in allegiance with him. The eternal effects of our sin, I should say. So some people say that the Old Testament sacrificial system was to get rid of sin. Animals was to get rid of sin. And then when God saw that people couldn't keep the commandments or, the laws, and that God then decided to send Jesus. But that is a misunderstanding and a misapplication of scripture, because the reality of the matter is the Old Testament sacrificial system was always intended to be about Jesus. Those lambs always represented Christ. Whether it was a dove or whatever offering you were making, that offering was always symbolic of Christ. That Colossians calls it a shadow. It was a type. It was a symbol of the real thing. And the real thing, the substance of that symbol, is Christ. So there was never a time where Christ was not the intended result or the intended meaning behind the sacrificial system. The people who were sacrificing lambs on altars were doing that in anticipation of the ultimate sacrifice, the lamb that would come to take away the sins of the world. The Bible says, okay, so we're also going to move forward now, because we're talking about the fact that it is one faith in two parts. So Romans 11 verses 21 through 24, starting at 21. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold therefore the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. And they also which abide not still in unbelief shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if thou wert cut off of the wild tree, which is of the olive tree rather, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be natural branches, be grafted to their own olive tree? So first, let me break down what is grafting. What is grafting? Here we have an image of a branch that was taken from one tree, and then we slit the trunk of another tree to graft in that branch. So it's a piece of a foreign tree that is grafted or made part of a new tree. And basically what happens is, as most times they bind. So you see that slit. Most times they'll bind, put a rope around it, because naturally as the tree grows, those two pieces will become fused together. And so this part that came from some other tree will now naturally become part of this one tree. It will be fed from the same roots. It will experience the same circumstances. It is now one tree. So that's what grafting is. So Christians are grafted into the faith, but what faith are we grafted into? The Judaic faith. It's the same faith. The tree is the same Judaic faith. The branches are people who become part of the tree. Notice also that unbelieving branches are cut off. It is all about faith and not about bloodline, but that's a discussion we're going to have later as well. But this is what is meant in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 29 when it says, if ye be Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise that was delivered unto Abraham. Okay, so remember that last verse from our selection in Romans 11, verse 24, for if thou were cut off the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be natural branches, be grafted into their own tree? It's their tree. It's the Jews' tree. The first Christians, the apostles, the original disciples, were all Jews. They didn't consider themselves converts. They had always been waiting for the Messiah. He came and they believed him. So if we had been born 20 years before Jesus came and we had been Jewish children growing up, we would be taught in the Jewish faith. We would be looking for signs in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. We would be looking for signs in the Bible for the Messiah, how to identify him when he comes, and the things that he's supposed to fulfill when he gets here. So they weren't moving on to a different religion. They moved forward to where God had always intended for them to go. So those who went where they were supposed to go didn't start a new faith. They just went to the next phase of the same faith. The next phase of the same faith. So let's break down what we've discussed. Jesus was a Jew. Christianity and Judaism are two parts of the same faith system, just like the Old Testament and the New Testament are two parts of the same Bible. The prophecies of the Old Testament are fulfilled in the New Testament. The lamb which takes away the sins of the world is Jesus. The lambs that they were sacrificing on the altar back in the day were never intended in and of themselves to take away sin, but to be symbolic of the same lamb or the lamb who would come and ultimately take away the sins of the world. We were grafted in to the Judaic faith according to Romans. We were grafted into that tree that is a Judaic tree as Christians. So one Bible, two sections, one faith, two phases. Now, Jesus, back to our original question, was Jesus a Christian or what faith was he? Jesus, being the fulfillment of Judaism, wouldn't technically be called a Christian. But if you consider the fact that these are the same faiths, you might logically conclude that he is a believer in the same faith that Christians believe. So I'll leave the question up to you how you want to technically answer whether Jesus was a Christian or not. But as to whether we are truly following him, there's no other way. God bless.